the world. Today, welcome to this special webinar. Today we'll address one of the most emergent issues for the current threats to our food security due to the war in Ukraine. And we'll share our thoughts and expertise together with more than 700 participants attending the event expectedly. Our speakers today represent the international European academics, also policymakers, but also farming companies from Ukraine, from OECD, from Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, and they all will address what the key implications are for the situation that we are looking at today for the global food markets. In this large audience, I would like to invite you to mute your microphone and to use the chat explicitly for posting questions and reflections to the panelists. We will try to answer questions as much as possible in the time that we have today during the discussion session, but also after the webinar. And the event will be recorded. And now please allow me to give the floor for the opening note of the event today to the President of Wageningen University and Research, Professor Louise Fresco. Professor Fresco, welcome.
Thank you, Vanya. Dobrego dnia to our colleagues, first of all, in Ukraine, our German colleagues, our European colleagues, and our colleagues everywhere. There could hardly have been a more timely moment for all of us to have this webinar. This morning, President Zelensky addressed online the Dutch Parliament, and it was very clear from his moving speech that one of the key issues is food, food markets, and food policies. So what better than having our seminar now? We have been working very hard at Wageningen to get a clearer view of the implications. The implications are multifold and they're complicated, of course, by definition. One is that we have to balance the regional effects of the current tensions and the war and the invasion. So that concerns Ukraine, but also Russia and Belarus. We have to look at the global effects on global food markets and production, of course. We have to look at the inputs. We have to look at the short-term and long-term issues. And I think we are all very aware that this is not just an economic or physical issue. It's also an issue of emotions, an issue of volatility due to emotions, and an issue, I think, where science needs to really keep its cool. It's important for us to analyze exactly what is happening, where the risks are, again, in the short term, in the long term, in the regional and in the global. And it's obviously that we are dealing with risks. These risks to world food situation, world food security are, of course, not entirely new. Not only have we had the 2007, 2008, 2009 shortages, but we have had, of course, in the past, in the distant past, also far more tensions. But today is new because I think there have been no other instances where it is so obvious that a country like Ukraine has such a pivotal role in world food supply. And where the region, Belarus and Russia, have, of course, a very important and essential role when it comes to energy, when it comes to things like potassium and other supplies. So we are in a difficult situation. Difficult because also of the timing. We're talking about spring, with spring planting, fertilizer of the winter crop. And we need to think about what is the best advice that can come from science to policymakers. The first thing I would like to say is let's get the facts clear. Let's get them clear so that we avoid unnecessary tensions, but also that we do not belittle the situation. The situation is important and dangerous and risky enough. Secondly, let's see what is needed from a scientific point of view to get to the best possible outcome, not just politically, but also in terms of food security. And this is where the work we do in other countries, particularly, of course, the countries most affected in Africa, in the Middle East, comes in very, very importantly. And I think we have an important role today to think about this and to come up with concrete recommendations. So I wish you a very good seminar or a very good webinar. Again, I couldn't think of a thing more urgent and more important to do. And I'm very pleased we are with so many people and we have our colleagues here. But let's make sure we just do not only talk, but come with concrete recommendations and steps forward in terms of science and in terms of recommendations to policymakers and of course politicians. So good luck in this webinar, and let me know what comes out of it. As some of you, and certainly my Wageningen colleagues know, I have been following this very, very closely. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you very much, Professor Fresco, for the great words. I would like now to invite the first keynote speaker of the event, and that is Mariia Bogonos, the head of the Center for Food and Land Use at the Kyiv School of Economics. Mrs. Bogonos, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. I am very happy that this seminar is taking place. It's indeed very timely and it's rather important. And it's also rather important that scientists from and also the stakeholders representing different views from on the agricultural sector are able to present their thoughts and their expectations and also their knowledge, and we will be able to discuss and exchange what indeed could be done or what are the potential effects are. In this time that I'm given during this webinar, I would like to pay some attention on the role of Ukraine in EU and Middle East food markets. Next slide, please. Well, yes, Ukraine exports around 70% of its total export quantities to the Middle East and African countries. This region is not only important for Ukraine as a destination trade partner, Ukraine is also important for these countries. Here on this table, you may see a data which shows self-sufficiencies in wheat and in corn of certain countries where Ukraine exports, and the share of Ukrainian wheat in the total imports of these countries, along with the amount of people there who live below poverty line or are food insecure. So, for example, if we take Bangladesh, where according to the FAO data, there are around 40 million people who live either below poverty line or are food insecure. This country is only by 20% self-sufficient in wheat, and it imports 14% from Ukraine. Egypt also has more than 30 millions of people who are living quite poor, and their imports from Ukraine constitute almost 40% in their total import quantities. Indonesia, 19 million people who live very poorly, 0% self-sufficiency in wheat, importing almost 30% of its wheat from Ukraine. Situation in Yemen is also quite serious, with a few millions of people living poorly and being very poorly sufficient in wheat, also imports a lot of wheat from Ukraine, nearly 26%. Next slide, please. No, the previous one. That's the third one. Yep, this one. In the EU, in the EU, Netherlands, Spain, and Italy are really large importers of sunflower oil and corn from Ukraine. For example, Spain and Netherlands import around 60% from Ukraine of its sunflower oil imports and around 30% of corn. The Netherlands have very low self-sufficiency in corn, and their imports from Ukraine are almost 40%. What does it say? It says a large dependence on Ukrainian wheat, corn, and sunflower oil of so many countries, including several EU countries. Next slide, please. We have done some preliminary simulations on what could happen to the production and exports from Ukraine of its main commodities, wheat, corn, and sunflower oil, if Ukraine loses around 30% of its harvesting area. We took 30% because it approximates the area under the current battles and missile shots, occupied territories, plus 50
Yeah,
kilometers.
I'm in one too, so I can't do much, but
50 kilometers of buffer zone. So keeping all other factors more or less constant, what happens if Ukraine loses 30% of its harvesting area? It almost equally goes into the reduction in production and reduction in export. What it means that around 30% of corn and wheat will not be exported, will not be produced as compared to the previous periods, and around 10 to 12% of sunflower oil. What is not considered here in this analysis is that the yields will not be record high. There will be no positive effect on the yield, so that the farmers, let's say, try to increase the yield because they lost area. This is the thing is that we are expecting spare use of fertilizers and plant protection measures. That's why the yields will not grow. They will not be record high. This is not in the analysis. And what's not in the analysis as well is that the prices for diesel for the machinery are higher as compared to the previous periods. So this is not considered here as well, which means that the effects might be even larger. The bottlenecks at the export spots, now it's western borders, are not considered as well. So this as well may increase the reduction in the exports. At this point, I think my time is over, and I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mariia, for very interesting insights in this data that is very relevant to review. I would like now to move to the second speaker for the pitch of about also 5 minutes, and that is Kees Huizinga. It's a large-scale farmer also operating in Ukraine. And he will tell us something about the implications for the Ukrainian agricultural production of the current situation. Welcome, Kees. Floor is yours.
Hello, thank you. My name is Kees Huizinga. I'm a Dutch farmer, having farmed in Ukraine for 20 years now. And I've just arrived back to the farm yesterday evening. I came from the Netherlands. I've been talking to a lot of politicians in the Netherlands, in Europe, in Germany, and to a lot of media people from newspapers, radio, and TV, to talk to them about the situation in Ukraine, and especially the food security worldwide, which is stemming from the war which Russia is doing here. And I started worrying about this like 2-3 days into the war. The first few days. First I have to mention, at the moment I'm speaking here, there's an air raid alarm going on. I'm in the village, so I'm not so worried. But yesterday evening there was an fighter jet flying over our village, and on Saturday evening there was a rocket launched from an airplane into our village, into a garden, and we are here in the middle of nowhere, supposedly feeling relatively safe, compared to Mariupol, Kharkiv, or Kyiv. So, but it is also happening here, and that's increasing the panic amongst the people and amongst the workers. So that's the that's in general not good, you know, for the mood and for the work. But to continue on the implications for farming in Ukraine and for the production, I started worrying about this a few days into the war after the biggest panic was over. And then I found a Rabobank research saying from January this year, they were not talking about a crisis in case of war. They were not talking about a crisis. They were not talking about a mega crisis. They are talking about a meta crisis with the implications for world food security. And as the previous speaker showed the numbers, and as Louisa Fresco said, you know, we have to go on science. I finished Wageningen Agriculture University, but I'm a farmer now. And, you know, you also have to include some farmers' logic and farmers' common sense. You know, and I've been thinking about this for many days and weeks and talking about it. And the more I talk about it, the worse it becomes. With my farmers' common sense, I can confirm the numbers from the previous speaker. You know, I was myself estimating 20% not being planted in Ukraine, but it will be even 30%. And the rest of the fields will be planted, but they will have lower yields because there's less fertilizer available. We, in our company, we are saving on fertilizer because we can't get it. So that means, yeah, you know, we will get lower yields. But also from colleague farmers around the world, I hear the same stories that they will use less fertilizer. And I got messages from colleagues from Mali and Nigeria, where fertilizer prices have tripled and fuel prices have doubled. So they will save on fertilizer. So that will also come on top of the shortages which will come from Ukraine. I talked to grain traders. You know, they are used when there's a drought somewhere in the world. They're used to 1-3% lower yields worldwide from the global seaborne trade. You know, here in Ukraine, if you calculate it quickly, it will be 10% less in the global seaborne trade. You know, and he says, this is such a huge number, I can't imagine what that's going to do, but I can imagine that it's going to create a disaster, especially in Northern African countries and Middle East countries. Going back to so that all stems from Ukraine, but also internally in Ukraine, I think we will have enough wheat for bread and other stuff to feed some pigs and some chicken. But for example, Kherson area, which is in the south of Ukraine and which is occupied by the Russians now, it accounts for 50 to 60% of the vegetables. It's like onions, carrots, red beet, cabbage, peppers, and that they won't plant those people. They don't have fuel, they don't have seeds. The irrigation system is probably not going to work. So that's internally in Ukraine, 50 to 60% less vegetables, which will internally be a huge problem. On top of this, the Russians are on purposely bombing distribution centers for supermarkets. Already 3 of them where we deliver our onions and carrots to are bombed, and they are gone. They are bombing storages for onions and for vegetables, for example. One of them where we delivered 3-4 years ago our onions and carrots to is also bombed and gone. There is cold freeze storages for meat. They are bombed. So fuel storages are bombed. So the Russians are on purpose trying of killing the food production in Ukraine.
Can you close up, Kees, now, and we can continue the discussion also?
Yes, I will. I mean, okay. So yeah, that's probably, you know, I mean, I think I've said everything I wanted to say. It's huge. It has huge impacts, and you know, we have to approach it by science way. But the only way to stop this and to stop this world food insecurity is to stop the war. You know, and I've been telling this message to everybody, and that's the only solution there is. You can science as long as you want. It doesn't stop the war, and if we don't stop this war now, a lot of the planting season for this year in Ukraine will be lost, and that will have a huge effect on world food supply. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kees, for this strong message that we all need to understand. So I would like to move to the next speaker, and that is Oleg Nivievskyi, also from the Kyiv School of Economics, the Vice President of the Economic Education. Floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I'd like just to add what my previous colleagues said. First of all, I'd just like to mention that the role of agriculture in Ukrainian economy and trade. Because if we account for agriculture upstream and downstream sectors, input supplies, processing, trading, that's about 22% of the national economy, of GDP. So a fifth of our economy generated basically to agriculture and to linked sectors. And also from the trade perspective, about more than 40% of export revenues come from agriculture. From export of agricultural goods, also quite a key sector for the national economy. And this is aside from a kind of macroeconomic. Sorry, my phone is kind of calling. Sorry, sorry, this happens. And yeah, so this is quite a key sector for Ukrainian economy, and this is kind of on top of what's going on right now on the implications of the war. Because if you know, 10 million of people in Ukraine left their homes, about 4 million left the country overall, and recently Ministry of Economy came up with the estimate that Ukrainian economy will shrink by 35%, so more than by a third.
Your microphone.
And a substantial contribution of this drop is due to agriculture, because as my colleagues mentioned, that 30% drop in agriculture, that's quite substantial for, and there is so much uncertainty how this is gonna develop because of the current war. Nobody knows how it ends. We have this, discussions and discussions of two sides, and it looks like it's gonna last for a while, and not sure when it ends. And it looks like the export routes are really endangered at the moment, like Black Sea ports. It's been blocked by Russian ships, and the only route right now is basically through the railways to the west and to the Baltic Sea. So this is kind of maybe not the only, but it's the only viable option, and nobody knows when the export routes will be unlocked, and that's gonna have a substantial impact on the food exports from Ukraine. And even now, there is so much discussion in Ukraine about liquidity, but just a kind of grain of salt. Imagine that even if farmers in Ukraine will harvest at least 50% of the current crops that were cropped before. How this going to be shipped? Okay, if this situation in Ukraine remains. So that's very difficult situation right now in Ukraine, and it looks like this great uncertainty will remains for some times. And the first, of course, condition to stop all this madness is just to stop the war. And and of course Ukraine needs support from all over the world in terms of kind of all things that you can think of in terms of support and in terms of investment, especially after rehabilitation, after the war finishes. So things like investment, rehabilitation plans, and especially when it comes, because we are basically presenting the institutions and lots of educational institutions, lots of scientists from Ukraine. They have kind of left their homes, and somebody left the country, and that's also kind of the flat or the kind of brain power kind of living in Ukraine, and this kind of also support that Ukraine is needed. Yeah, with that, I'd like to give a floor to another speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oleg, and we continue also in the discussion session when there are quite some questions already arriving in the chat we see. So let me move to the next speaker, and that is Hubertus Hai, Senior Agricultural Policy Analyst from OECD. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I think it's difficult to speak after the Ukrainian voices now, and our thoughts are clearly with the people in Ukraine. And I think the hope is, and really the pressure is that hopefully this war ends as soon as possible with this is less damage, additional damage, and a good rebuilding afterwards. And I think also on all the effects, what it will have, and that's the thing I just read in a agriculture magazine in an editorial today. How will it affect global markets? We don't know. But I think it's already important to exchange about it, to see what's happening, what's around, and when you can go to the next slide. And I think that links already a bit what also Mariia, next slide, please. What Mariia said is the importance of Ukraine in global cereals and also oilseed markets. I have here only the cereals section, where you see how it is important as an exporter to provide to those countries who are dependent on imports, like in North Africa and also Indonesia, like it's also mentioned already in the chat and also presented by Mariia. There it's important that grains come, and they're coming often from Ukraine. So that is a shock on the market, and you see that other countries are important, and it's also important on the global market how much others can fill it. So when you look at wheat, we had a disastrous harvest also in Canada. When you go to the next slide. Next slide. So you see the price development, and it was already, and you see the line in the background is the daily and monthly prices, and you see already that it was already elevated before the crisis, and that were other pressures. We were already in a situation globally in the wheat markets where supplies were short. That was especially because of the harvest in another important exporter in Canada, where there was a shortfall of 35%, and that already started. And then came this uncertainty in addition, and really get another spike into it. And linking also to Maria's intervention earlier, we did already try to look at some scenarios, and you have here a mild and an extreme scenario, and the mild scenario is very close to the assumptions which Mariia presented. So that means it means a push of world prices by 14%, only because of those effects in the Ukraine. That pushes global prices by 14%. What is in this scenario, which is a very situation when it stops now and it goes now on. But of course, that could be more extreme. And that will even make shortages globally more severe and cause actually more disturbance. And of course, the prices on the daily market react stronger and react faster. They are at the moment going a bit down because there's more knowledge where something available, and also reaction of other countries. Notably, India appeared as an exporter of wheat, partly out of their reserves, which actually helps a bit to alleviate the shortages on the global wheat markets. So there are other countries which help. Next slide. And then looking on the policy side, and I think that's important, and that's actually we need a flexible response on the current situation, and especially also for the rebuilding. And there, the whole community of countries, of OECD countries and other countries, is required to support Ukraine in the rebuilding, and also during this phase as much as possible to have the impact for the food sector as little as possible, but also for other sectors and for the society. But it needs to be in the framework of international cooperation and responsibility. So it needs a cooperation. It's not somehow one side, and it's the trade international trading system is required. We should avoid export restriction to fuel the situation even more. It's information exchanges on the agricultural market information system and other platforms, and also this kind of exchanges, that there's exchange on the situation, there's discussions, information sharing, what's the situation, how can we help each other? This is important to bring it forward. And then is the question about the longer term. There is a discussion on how food and agriculture policy address the triple challenge. So we want to ensure food security and nutrition for all globally. We have to have livelihoods for farmers. Farmers make a living and other people along the food chain. And of course, we have the pressure to keep our natural resources and also reducing emission of greenhouse gases. And this all combined, of course, the question is, do we have a new discussion after this crisis? But that's more longer term. The other parts are short term. And I think we have to be in the discussion trying not to over incorporate it. But of course, there will be a shift a bit in those objectives and what is important due to this kind of crisis. With that one, I close. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these insights, very important messages as well from your presentation. I would like now to give the floor to Jacob Waslander, who can give us some reflection on the situation that will be taking place in Middle East and North Africa from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. Welcome, Jacob. Your floor is yours.
Thank you, Vania, and thank you for having me in this seminar. I'm the Dutch envoy to the Middle East and Northern Africa for water, energy, and food, and I'm speaking to you from Amman, Jordan. My aim is to help these countries to get more efficient and sustainable use of scarce resources, which are water, energy, and food. And this region faces very important challenges. Think of the social challenges, the refugees in the MENA region from the Syrian war, from the war in Libya, war in Yemen, and also the Palestinian conflict. This country where I live, Jordan, for example, hosts more than 1.3 million refugees from Syria and 1.3 million refugees from the Palestine region, to name but an example. Unemployment is high, youth unemployment especially. But moreover, we face here in this region the consequences of climate change. Heat stress is very high. 54 degrees Celsius in Baghdad is not an exception anymore. And water stress. In Jordan, for example, only 2/3 of all water demand can be met. There is no more water. What does it mean, this context for food security? It's still difficult to assess what the consequences are, but there is a risk. Last week I was in Lebanon. 75% of their wheat import comes from Ukraine and Russia. And you may recall 1.5 years ago, they had this huge explosion in the harbor of Beirut, and that destroyed also their storage facilities. So they have less than 3 weeks of stocks of very essential food for them. And so that's now leading to rationing food distribution. Egypt, 60% of their imports from Ukraine and Russia of their wheat, and they are quite highly dependent of wheat imports. They produce themselves as well, but it's only 40% of what they need. So this disruption in trade is also for them an important event. And food stocks are getting under stress in this region. And I hear also in meetings I had in other countries that there is concern that between countries that they may start buying up each other's food stocks and that there may be imposed restrictions on trade, which would be quite unfortunate. The price volatility is high. You see prices rising, and there's a lot of search for other sources for imports, but it's not going fast, and it's really becoming a problem. So once again, what this will be leading to is unclear, but there is stress on the food situation. And also for the longer term, and that's my last point, what I'm concerned about is that countries here in the region, with this huge water stress and heat stress they're facing, nevertheless will try to become more food import independent and try to grow staple crops in desert, arid like regions, which is very unsustainable. We may recall from Saudi Arabia that they used to export wheat, which was produced in their deserts, but it was using so much water that fortunately they stopped this practice because that's not sustainable. And we may face this tendency to try to turn back to unsustainable food production. And so that would be really not helping to reach our jointly set sustainable development goals. And that leads me to an appeal that we, as European Union, must make sure that also our global trade and essential food crops must remain open and free flowing, so that also food production in other countries can be used to the maximum extent as possible to make sure that food production remains efficient and sustainable. So thank you for this, giving me the floor, and I give the floor back to you, Vanya.
Thank you very much, Jakub, for very strong message also on your side. Now I would like to move to our discussion part of the day, and I would like to give the floor to Rico Ichle from Wageningen University and Research Assistant Professor on Agricultural Economics. Rico, you will present shortly the key statements and propositions of our speakers today, and based on that we can continue the discussion. I see there are quite some questions in the chat, and we'll try to answer those as well. Questions to the panelists today, to the key speakers.
Yes, thank you, Vanya. Let me summarize briefly the main points of the presenters. So Mariia Bogonos made the proposition that reduction in agricultural production and exports in Ukraine will put food security in vulnerable countries at high risk. Oleg Nivievskyi basically said his main message was that the agri-food sector generates more than 40% of foreign exchange revenues and 22% of Ukraine's GDP. Current exports termination and the gloomy crop forecast will knock down Ukraine's economy. Hubertus from OECD, he stressed that OECD countries need to adopt flexible responses in the framework of international cooperation and responsibility. And there is one proposition of a colleague who could not join on short notice, but he argued that the EU should not only revise its defense strategy due to the new geopolitical situation, but it also needs to reconsider its food security strategy within the farm-to-fork strategy. And then at last, Jakob Waslander made the point that the EU must make sure that global trade in important food stocks can carry on to make sure that production and distribution is efficient and to avoid unsustainable production practices. And with this summary of the 6 presentations, I would give first the word to Harm de Wilde, who is a professional commodity trader, to comment on that. And afterwards, Reinoud Nuiten will have the word, who is the agricultural counselor of the Dutch embassy in Ukraine, and also to share some of his ideas about the topic. Harm, so the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me today. So my name is Harm de Wilde. I work as a market analyst for Sofitra. Sofitra is a company that sources feed ingredients worldwide, which we sell to the European compound feed industry, as well as the food industry. And yeah, naturally, we source a lot of commodities from the Ukraine as well. So think of sown meal as well as corn. And I'll like to share 4 points with you, some observations and open questions that I have. So first of all, point number one is that you could argue today that in the last 1.5 to 2 weeks, the European all crop grain supply and demand balance sheet seems much more manageable than it seemed at the beginning of the invasion. So we've seen, for example, that Spain lowered the requirements on pesticides and insecticides to import corn, so that makes it possible to import Argentine corn. We see that happening. We see the EU importing US corn, despite that it is GMO. There are a lot of GMO events grown in the US that are also approved within the EU. And the level that we were importing and the remaining of the old crop is actually still below what we imported 40 years ago when we had a drought within the EU. We also see much more corn offers from Brazil, which is very unique because their second corn crop arrives only in July, but we already see significant volume coming from Brazil today. And I think what's very key, and I just got this information just right now, is that we've seen in the past Ukraine moving, let's say, 300,000 tons of agri-commodities by train and truck overland into the EU. And we now see the Ukraine moving more than 1 million tons a month overland. And there's talk that we maybe could do like 2 million tons. Of course, it's all challenging, but we see this happening. And so what I'm trying to say here is that we have been facing more supply recently, while European consumer increased its coverage sharply at the beginning of the invasion. So as a result, the old crop is much more relaxed. You see the focus of the market, that brings me to point number 2, is moving from the old crop to the new crop. And there, as Mr. Huizinga pointed out earlier, there's a risk that farmers will not plant everything this spring, that we might not harvest everything this spring, farmers not apply all the fertilizer. The risk is that infrastructure gets damaged, that we cannot get everything out the way we want it. And I think also a big risk is that world importing countries cannot manage to pay for Russian agriculture commodities. That brings me to point number 3. I think, Russia is one of the largest grain and oilseed exporting countries in the world. One could argue that prices might go higher if, on a global level, if Russian exports won't reach their export potential, as a lot of importing countries will not manage to pay for Russian goods. As you know, Russia is being cut off from SWIFT. They require certain commodities to be paid in rubles. For countries like China and India, that might not be a problem, but for developing countries like, for example, Zimbabwe, we heavily depend on Russian wheat, it is very challenging. And it makes a huge difference for world commodity prices if Russia will manage to export 36 million tons of wheat or only 30. What I think is also important to point out here is that the EU stands for movement of free movement of people, goods, and services, capital. And we've seen in the beginning of the invasion, we've seen a lot of Eastern European countries arguing that they want export bans or buy intervention, and I think that's the last thing we should want. We should not install and starve your neighbor kind of policy, especially not within the EU. I think so far things are a bit more are a bit more relaxed, but yeah, the risk is still there, and I think we should all, as policymakers, kind of like try to prevent that. That brings me to point number 4, and it's maybe something more for discussion. Is you could argue that globalism is deteriorating. Nobody really knows how the future looks like, but I think we can argue that the supply and demand outlook for agriculture commodities is going to be less certain than we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years. I think we can state that as a fact. I think what you can also state as a fact is that in the last couple of years, European consumers, compound feed producers, flour mills, you name it, they have been indirectly competing with the Chinese government, which has been actively buying and selling grains and oilseeds for intervention stocks. So if the EU would buy commodities today, I think it's not a wise thing to do in this very tight market, because you create artificial demand. However, the question that I would like to ask this panel is that what is the opinion regarding the question if the EU should build strategic stocks in years to come when supply returns in a larger availability that we are facing now, because globalism, you could argue, is deteriorating, that we stand up for ourselves as for European citizens.
Yeah, indeed. That's very important points.
Yeah.
Thank
so
you.
To summarize, we see old crop being solved, new crop, the switches to that's where the risk is. And 3, what can we do now to fight food inflation? It's think the government should actively try to organize that a lot of importing countries can pay for Russian goods. And then 4 is more the long-term question that we need to take care more of ourselves. I think that's the message I try to get across.
Yeah, thanks indeed. That's 4 very important aspects. Reinhard, I would now give the word to you.
Yes, thank you, Rico. The war is destroying the Ukrainian agricultural sector. This has been explained already by previous speakers. I want to repeat the words of Mr. Huizinga and stress that this is a deliberate strategy of the Russian army. As agricultural counselor at the Netherlands Embassy to Ukraine, my experience lies in Ukraine. So I will not focus too much on the international food supply issues which have been discussed, because that's not my field of expertise. Instead, I want to make a moral appeal to support Ukraine in providing them at this moment with enough food resources, because they did it before and now they're in trouble. So they should be helped, I feel, and they are being helped. That is something I want to say at the same time. A lot of schemes are already being developed. The OECD was mentioned. They are working on a big scheme. There are also a number of private schemes. And although I must also say that the Ukrainian government at this moment manages to organize the basic supply of food to the population quite well, there are still shortages. You can think about shortage of fuel, crop protection means, machine parts, but also about protection of cattle and the supply of and distribution of seeds throughout the country. And there are many other topics. So all kinds of support are useful. But also think about real food supplies, canned foods, vegetables. This is what the population can need. Maybe not in the cities almost as much, but also in the regions where it's harder to come. Next to these immediate support, please also keep focus on support by the time that Ukraine is able to rebuild the agriculture sector. Again, I'm repeating what has been said. The basic agriculture infrastructure is being destroyed. Food storages are being bombed. There are mines and fields. Machineries are destroyed, and I could go on. So this needs to be rebuilt. I see this as a moral. I should put on my camera. I'm sorry. I see this as not only as a moral obligation, which I do, but I also see this is in the interest of the international community, because we talked about international food security. if we want to have the international supply of food from Ukraine, we have to rebuild their capacity so that they are able to be fulfilling this function in the future again. Obviously, this is something which from our Ministry of Agriculture, we try to support to the extent that it is in our power, and there are many other parties involved, EU, other member states, other countries. So that process is ongoing. I must also say that from the private sector, there are many initiatives. So the support is already very good and well developed, but I hope that this will stay and that this support will help Ukraine and its people to get through these hard times. That's it. Thank you for the words, and I hope you will have a good discussion.
Thank you a lot, Reinoud. And with this last individual view, we would now go over into the general discussion, and I would give several questions to the panelists in order to exchange some thoughts on them. One question which has been asked was that Russia and other countries restricted in the 2008 food crisis their exports. And this made the situation worse on an international scale. Is it likely to happen again this year or the next years? Oleg.
Yeah, I mean, I can answer. At least I can discuss this issue to some extent. I think nowadays we can talk about the export restrictions in Russia, but from the other side, if you think about the sanctions that were imposed on Russia, that means this country will also be suffering a lot in terms of reduced yields, because I mean the imports of input supplies, modern input supplies will be restricted. Spare parts will not be probably available, so that means they will be having the same kind of situation as Ukraine now. So there's going to be reduced yields, output and exports, and probably, I mean, in the worst case scenario, they will be exporting nothing, because, I mean, at the moment, everything that is coming from Russia is considered as a kind of with blood, kind of toxic, and that there's, I mean, traders will think about 1,000 times before, buying this stuff. Not sure how long this will continue, but I think we can also expect this kind of reduction of output and exports from Russia as well. And of course, I mean, that's going to have repercussions across the world, including the kind of this hunger rise that everybody is talking about in the Middle East and Northern Africa countries. Over to you,
Hubertus.
I think on the terms of export restrictions, I think we already see some movements, and I think that's also why it's important to call on the global community that also export restrictions in this event, and I think coming to other countries, also reducing the availability of material on the global markets is actually harming the food security in other parts, and actually adding to this situation. They might improve it for some countries domestically, but globally it's harming. And I saw one comment on India, but they have a good harvest, but there's already a sign that they start actually to release and export commodities which they wheat, which they normally not do. So that's a positive other example. The same is Indonesia on the terms of palm oil. Normally they have a very high domestic requirement of domestic use requirement, which they have lifted. So that already came also on the market. So they are also countries which are actually adding to relieve the tight situation on global markets, which came out of this situation. And I think that's also important to mention. It's not only those who restrict, but also some countries which lifted measures, which opening the markets.
Yes, indeed. Jakob, can you switch on your camera?
I thought it's switched on.
No.
Perhaps it's the connection, but because my camera...
Now it's switched on.
Yeah, excellent, good. On the global trade, I think it's, and that was also one of the points I made, it's terribly important that we keep global trade going, that we also base our decisions much more on data and clear analysis. And then you will see that if the situation hopefully soon stabilizes again, Ukraine can pick up again, and a person like Kees Huizinga can go back to his normal work, that the export of wheat, barley, and so on from Ukraine makes sense. You should not have farmers here having such huge staple crops like barley or wheat. They can do it, but it would be such a waste of scarce water and energy. They should cultivate other products here. So it's terribly important, and that's where I think the European Union has a key role to play to make sure that the food, which in principle, the staple crops are still available from other sources, that they are being used and distributed in an orderly fashion, that indeed we don't have trade restrictions, but make sure that there is a good allocation of resources available. Because if we don't, if we lock ourselves in as European Union, as one of the options was raised, I think that that's really detrimental in the longer term also to our own security, stability, because our neighboring countries, the countries where I'm living in, where I'm working, and if they really get out of balance further, they will find boats or they will take their car, or if they need to, they will walk to places where at least they can find a better place to live. And that's not in our interest as well. So we have to keep relations solid and trade open so that indeed we help each other to have a safe, sustainable future. So keep trade going, and that's where the EU has an important role to play. Back to you.
Would you then, based on that, would you think that the EU should adapt its long-time policy goals in the arena of agriculture? Because up to now, more and more extensivation has been followed up, and should that be adapted in order to ensure that sufficient food security on a global scale?
I can't speak to that in detail because I don't know the details of the EU food policies. But what I do know is that we must make sure that if we base ourselves really on data and make sure that if we have investment plans, also for the region where I'm working, we come to an allocation of resources and the way of production which is most efficient and which is sustainable. And that's where I think the EU has an interest to make sure that every country, every region, every business group, every farmer has a role to play in making sure that we have food security. So that's where I would want to come from. And that's where I think the interests are common for everybody.
And what would you think about the long-term perspectives? Will the agricultural policies in the West and globally change due to this major risk to markets? How would you see the long-term development of the agricultural and food security policies?
My concern is, and like I said, I was in Lebanon last week. Yesterday I was in Saudi Arabia, and next week I'll be in Egypt. There is a lot of concern, uncertainty, also because they have neighbors which are in conflict. I mentioned the countries Libya, Syria, Yemen, the Palestine conflict. So countries think that they have to rely more and more on themselves and start developing agricultural practices which are not sustainable. And that is something we should warn them about, but also help them to take away the concerns there are. So we must help to make the imports and also the food production of and making the availability of essential products, make sure that that is a reality. So that is what I see as key, and that is where I think we should not stimulate countries to be solely relying on their own resources for their own population. We should make sure that markets are open and that these type of essential crops can flow freely. That will help us also to reach the SDGs.
Just to mention that it's 5 o'clock, but we can continue the discussion. So please stay for who wants to stay. And maybe we can move to one of the other questions we have. We have quite some questions in the chat.
Yes.
I see here also a question from Wageningen researcher about the different qualities of the wheat, such as share of durum wheat and wheat for feed. How do you deal with data for the quality of the wheat?
Can I react on that one? You know, if you, as a farmer, if you use less fertilizer, especially in this case, a nitrogen fertilizer, it's not only the yield which will go down. I mean, if you have enough rain, your yield will stay stable, but then you won't have enough protein in your wheat, and then it's not good enough to make bread from. So lower uses of nitrogen fertilizer will also decrease the quality of the grain, and that will be of the quality of the wheat, and that will make you have less bread wheat or baking wheat available for the bread.
Thank you. Rico, would you like to pick up another question from the chat?
Yes, there has been a question by one participant about the current situation of global grain stocks. To what extent can they partially compensate for the low production?
I happened to read a Rabobank report about this, and they compared the current situation with the beginning of the First World War. And back in those days, the world was there was less production from the Black Sea area, relatively compared to now, and the world grain stocks were higher compared to now. So my conclusion from this is that the situation now is worse than in the beginning of the First World War. So they are not high, the stocks.
Hubertus.
Yeah, I can agree that the stocks are not high, especially as we have seen also this very deep drop in Canadian harvests. And there were, in terms of wheat, we don't have high stocks, but we have stocks available to come through the season. But of course, the prices indicate that it's tight and that rations demand. And the question is how much demand needs to be rationed and how that will impact, again, the food security for those who are most in need. And we are just coming out of the situation, out of the COVID crisis, and where also, again, the poor are hit the most, and they don't have so much income. So that requires, the question is whether there is, in the end, the World Food Program needs help to adjust for that one, to bridge the gap between what people can afford and what they need for basic needs. And I think the availability at a price is there, but the price is high. And that makes it, of course, for the poorer one, very difficult. And the question is how to bridge that gap for those people.
If I just may add to the whole grain stock discussion, yes, global stocks in key origins are very low. However, wheat stocks in the United States are basically double than that of 07-08. 07-08 was the year when we faced 300 euros motif. And the reason why US wheat stocks are high is that every time we have a problem in the world, and US smells that they have to do some wheat export, they run away from it in terms of price. And some argue that this is caused by the variable storage rate that is implemented on Chicago in 2008. And I'm not saying that this is true, some argue that. So yeah, if Ukraine would be a real disaster and will not manage to plant, harvest, all that, the world will eventually need to turn to US wheat stocks. And that will go at a price, you could argue.
And would that also mean that, another question related to that from the audience, that less agricultural resources should be used for bioenergy generation in this setting? Who would like to comment on that?
I can start a bit on commenting. I think there we are in a situation where we are also discussing the energy independence and where's the energy coming from. And there's another argument that people say, yeah, biofuels can help on that side. But I think that this balance is very difficult. And I think extending it at this moment is breaching it, as there are shortages on the food side. But on the other hand, it also gives you more independence and on the independence of your energy consumption. So I think it is, of course, a possibility, but it's not as fast as it's now available. You cannot stop everything now. And I think that needs to be in the equation at the end. But it's also the energy independence, which is the other discussion. When you say you make the recommendation, you have also to see that we need the energies, and that is also, which links into this food crisis, and especially in this situation. And that's why it's always linked, energy and food.
Yeah, there are also some questions in the chat related to the longer term crises of climate and biodiversity next to this. And also the relation with the reactions of the food companies, also for the oil, the palm oil demand increase instead of the sunflower oil and the other food producing, which cost from alternative oil solutions.
I just want to add is that food versus fuel debate is a very difficult debate, but I just want to state one fact which I think is important to take into equation when you discuss this, is that in the EU we use 12 million tons of grains approximately for ethanol production, but this ethanol industry also produces something like 5 million tons of dry distilled grain solubles, which is a protein component which the European feed industry uses. If we look at the EU uses a large amount of vegetable oils for biodiesel and nowadays HVO production. With that we also produce a lot of rapeseed meal, soy meal that is also used by the feed industry. So it's not just one-to-one.
Oleg, would you like to comment on that? Okay. So let me take up another question. Isn't Russian wheat simply going to other destinations, for example, to China? So to what extent does this significant political destabilization change global trade flows? And how sustainable would you, or how enduring would that change in global trade flows be? What do you think about that?
Yeah, okay. I think Putin is going to manipulate with wheat You know, he promised wheat to China. He promises wheat to India. So that's why those countries are not very aggressively acting against Russia. They are just saying we want to have peace, but they don't let Russia down, so to say, because they will be depending on Russian wheat, and he might also manipulate Northern African countries, you know, by offering them some cheap wheat if they start to poke around in Europe, or you know, so effectively he is creating a second front on the south side of Europe by depriving them of food, and then later be able to manipulate them, you know. So and in this way destabilizing Europe. So I'm not. Logistically, it will be all not so easy because a lot of wheat, as I understood, will goes through the Azov Sea, and that's blocked now. So Russia has logistical problems there as well. So you know, and I think China underestimated the power of the Ukrainian army. So it's difficult to predict, but you know, and again, we can talk about this for ages. The only way to get back to normal is to stop this war. And you know, in Europe, people and politicians are too afraid, you know, to stop Putin. And you know, the only borders Putin understands is where he kicks in, where Russians understand is where they get kicked in the ass, you know, and that's what we have to show. You know, and that's the only solution. All the other solutions are kind of plasters to the wounds, and don't solve the situation.
Reinoud, are you still present? And so basically, Kees, based on that, so would you think that the geopolitical importance of food trade will increase as a result of that political crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everybody's always talking about oil and gas, but as I've said, you can't eat oil and gas, you know. And I mean, you can if you're cold, you can put on an extra coat, but if you don't eat for a week, then you know, then it gets difficult to survive. Yeah, so you know, and it has always been so normal for especially Western European people to have food on the shelves and a loaf of bread in the bakery, because we spend so little money on this. Like only 8 to 9% of our income is spent on food. So you know, it has become too normal to have enough food, you know, and we're buying telephones for 700 euros, but we don't think about food, you know. What we can do without a telephone, we can't do without food. So yeah, food should be way more important in geopolitics than it is now.
Maybe one question related to this that I see is that we've been observing a lot of issues with the sunflower oil supply already. Can you elaborate more on trends in the near future as Ukraine's world's largest supplier of sunflower oil? And another question next to that, the US plans to use more corn for bioethanol. Should we not avoid this even more in these times? It will further tighten markets. So indeed, in the Netherlands, there is already empty shelves as well as in Belgium, sunflower oil.
If I may just add quickly to respond to the question regarding corn, we should not forget is that in the US, every time you buy gasoline in the US, you buy 90% gasoline and 10% ethanol. In the US, we're already running at a blending wall, is how they call it. So yeah, to really increase ethanol consumption in the US is quite challenging, some argue. So talk is different versus action.
And on top of this, you know, the corn for ethanol is mainly grown in the corn belt, and you can't really grow wheat there. The climate is just not good enough, and farmers just don't make enough money on this, and they don't have the equipment for it either. They are focused on corn and soybeans, so it's not that easily replaced by wheat, for example. You know, and you don't bake a lot of bread from corn. So, you know, that's also, you know, as a farmer, you don't just overnight change from one crop to another. You also have to take into account your crop rotation, you know, so that's all long-term discussions, and it doesn't solve short-term issues.
I could add.
Mariia, go.
Okay, thanks. I could add on the question regarding sunflower oil supply from Ukraine. Two major issues related to sunflower oil exports from Ukraine. The first one is that in 2021 and the years before, we had this wonderful opportunity to export through the seaports. And to those ports, we had our railway, which the farmers or the exporters used a lot. Now, of course, all these ports are closed, and the exporting is trying to reorient towards the western borders, so to say, safer borders, safer areas. The problem with that is that the ability of those points of crossing the border is very narrow in terms of quantities that they can get through in one day. So the same concerns, for example, export via the Danube River. It's very different from the abilities of the sea if you compare the river and the sea. So bottlenecks is one thing. There are issues to solve with the logistics. It's railway issues that this railway company of Ukraine should be able to transport more, and it's also the issue of these points, of these border points, to be able to get through more products. And another big aspect on the sunflower oil is that the vast majority of our larger sunflower oil producers, yes, this is processors of sunflower seeds, are situated in central and eastern regions of Ukraine. This is rather risky. We have only one larger producer who is situated in the southwest. So with the battles continuing being intensive in the eastern regions and moving to the central regions, we are getting more and more risk of this touching or affecting the sunflower oil processors.
And I can add to this some practical examples. I've just been, first of all, the railroad tracks in Ukraine are wide tracks. In Europe, they are smaller tracks. So you have to overload the Ukrainian wagons into European wagons if you want to do this. I was just visiting the Romanian-Ukrainian border and visiting a facility to do this. They can do 7 wagons in 24 hours. A whole train is like 50 or 60 wagons. That's like 3,000 tons. And a whole ship is 60,000 tons. So, you know, and they fill this ship in 1 or 2 days. So 60,000 tons in 1 or 2 days. The Romanian border crossing does 1,000 tons in 2 days. So 60 times less. So it is physically impossible to export the amount of commodities we are producing by rail or by truck. For example, I've been calculating to export my crop production by truck to Constanța in Romania. That will take, I will be needing 50 trucks driving 300 days per year to bring all my crop to, that's only my farm, 50 trucks, 300 days per year to bring it to Constanța in Romania. You know, now last year I've been doing this with 20 trucks in 100 days, for example, or even less. So of course, it can be increased a little bit towards the west by train or by truck, but it will be a drop in the sea because it's physically impossible to do this on the short term. You know, in the long term, you can build, like in a period of 5 to 10 years, you can build huge facilities on the borders. But that's again not a solution for the short term. The only solution is to unblock the ports through military support from the West, so these international trading companies can bring in and out ships to export Ukrainian products. There is still around 30 million tons of Ukrainian commodities to be exported from last year's harvest. That's about a third of last year's harvest. So that's also blocked from international markets. So that's also a thing which has to be solved within the next few days.
There have been several questions in the chat on the implications of other agricultural activities, for example, for seed production and also livestock production. Who could share some views on that?
I can probably. I just, if it continues like this, we don't need any feedstock of agricultural commodities for feed production. I just like before this meeting, I got a video from a dairy farm in the east of the country, near to Kharkiv. It was bombed, and there was dead cows lying all around, and cows running around, and there was no milking facilities anymore. So, you know, if it continues like this, we don't need feed for them. So that situation can be solved very quickly by the Russians. A little bit cynical, of course, but normally, like corn and silage corn, we can produce for our own needs. Grains for chickens and pigs will be enough internally in Ukraine as well. But the processing companies who do the sunflower seeds, and so the oil, they take out the oil, and the rest is being used for feed, for dairy, for example, or for pigs, and the same with soybeans. Yeah, that will be more and more difficult to get, because those factories either are bombed or people have fled and they're not able to work. Plus all the other ingredients, that will also be a problem. We are having difficulties to find stuff to feed our cows and our pigs. So, or at least it gets more complicated, you know. And yeah, so yeah, it's absolutely an issue.
Rico, you're muted.
Maybe Harm, you could comment on that. Would you think is production right now and in the coming months the bigger problem, or is it logistics?
Yeah, I think it's the combination. I mean, we can produce a lot, but if you cannot move it, yeah, it's no value. So it's the combination. But I have to say that, and I think Kees can confirm that, under difficult circumstances, people become very innovative. I think what I said in my talk earlier, we saw that Ukraine moved in the past max 300,000 tons by month of all products by land. And now we see them moving already like 1.5 million tons by month. And we think they can do even more than that. It is challenging, but we see previous records being broken. Of course, it's not in comparison to the 6 million tons that they did by month via seaports. But yeah, it's more than we were maybe thinking a month ago.
Yeah, but it's still a drop in the sea, you know. I mean, if Ukraine exports like 60 million tons a year, so, you know, if we do 1 million tons a month by rail, or even 2 million tons, that makes 20 or between 12 and 24 million tons. So there's still roughly 40 million tons left to be exported. But
No,
of
I
course,
totally agree.
we won't plant 30%. So of course we save transportation there as well. Again, a little bit skeptical.
Maybe also a question to Kees or the OECD. There was a question about the substitution of rising the prices of the rice if the wheat supply will be impeded for some countries like Indonesia or similar. And maybe another question in the last minutes, whether there are any alternatives and shifts for agricultural productions within Eastern Europe, because with similar soil and climate. How do you see that from shifting some supplies?
I can start with the first one. I think one thing is what you see on the global grains markets. One exception to the price development at the moment is rice. So rice, there's sufficient supply on the markets. The rice prices have not increased much. So actually rice at the moment is in some places even cheaper than wheat. Normally it's substantially more expensive. So there might be some substitution by rice as a staple ingredient, but it's very often dependent how the diets are, and rice is not cheaper than wheat when you are culturally bound to it. So there might be some effect, but so far it's not been seen that rice gets so much more expensive, and it's actually at the moment cheaper than wheat. And then on I think the production potential for other regions, I think the problem is always the short-term reaction. I think when you have a longer-term adjustments, there might be something possible, but for the next season, the harvest in the summer, the planting is done now or has been done beforehand, and there's not much flexibility. So there might be a bit more intensive production, but even though with the high cost of fertilizer and of energy, that's also limited. So the reaction to shift it very rapidly is not there. And the question is, that takes time, and then how the markets will also react. And when the Ukraine is rebuilding, and what we are hoping that it's very soon happening, then the production will be back, and I think then the security look different. And when there's lots of support to rebuilding that fast, I think that's should be one of the efforts to get that one on again. And I think that's is much more promising. Shifting in another reason by intensification is limited.
Mariia, what would you think? What time frame will be needed in order to restore Ukraine's agricultural potential?
Yeah, difficult to say. Depends on how much would be damaged. If we judge from the damages right now of today, I think it can be restored rather quickly, because we have seen a very quick development of the sectors after 2014. Some of the factories had to, or processors or producers had to move from the east to the central and western regions, and they did it, and it took 2 or 3 years for some trends to recover. Yeah, but if the infrastructure, like logistical infrastructure, is destroyed, the railways and the roads, then or the ports even, it will take, of course, more time. And it will also depend on how much, on the intensity of this restoration. So of course it will depend on the financial abilities, on the access to funds, and so on.
Jakob, you wanted to add?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to follow up on this point because, like my colleague from our embassy in Kyiv already mentioned, we also have to think now about how we can help to rebuild Ukraine. Unfortunately, the situation is still not there that we can start with that. The war is still ongoing, but hopefully soon this can happen. And so that's one track we have to work on very quickly. The second track, and I come back to trade and especially price volatility of food, but also of energy. I saw now the analysis of FAO about the effect of the Ukraine-Russian crisis on the number of undernourished, and that will increase worldwide in a modest scenario with 7.6 million people, and in a severe scenario with more than 13 million people. So people outside of Ukraine who will also be impacted directly by this situation. Those are people often which are already very vulnerable. I think of refugees. When you read World Food Programme analysis, they already have a lack of food to distribute to refugees. I see it here in northern Jordan, where people are just getting a lack of food, Syrian refugees, and that will worsen further. And so we also, besides this rebuilding of Ukraine, hopefully soon, we have also an immediate urgency to think through how we can keep flows going and get food and get the right energy to people, which are really not well off at all and will come in an even worse situation as a consequence of the war in Ukraine. Back to you.
Ukraine is also a big contributor to the UN World Food Programme, so that's also missing out now.
Yeah.
And the general public is also doesn't know a lot about agriculture. For example, I had a question of a journalist asking, do you already see a decline in production? And I didn't really understand the question, but because I didn't start planting yet, so there is no production, you know. And so how fast can you restore Ukrainian agriculture? Yeah, next year. I mean, this year is more or less lost. So the next chance is next year, you know, and if we don't solve it before next year, 2024 is the next chance. So, I mean, we can find all kinds of storages, you know, you can do it outside and cover it with plastic, for example, if your storage is damaged. There we can be creative, but the next chance is next year, and the chance afterwards is in 2 years. So, and that's very important for everybody to understand, and the majority of the people don't understand this.
Thank you very much. This was very good closing words, I think. We now come to the end of this event. We will try to answer the questions that we could not answer. So please see in this chat the link to the website where we also will place the recording for maybe colleagues of yours that could not join today, would like to watch back. I would like to really thank you very much to all the participants and also especially to the key speakers today for sharing all these thoughts and views and expertise, really quite wise comments and reflections we've seen today. So thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers. A lot of courage to the Ukrainian colleagues and to the Ukrainian people. So we hope we keep in touch, and this was really a first attempt to come together on such an important topic. Thank you very much to all, and please we stay in touch and follow our further messages and events.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.